Your writing has been political in all sorts of ways, ever since
On and
Advice
off.
Children.
On and off, yeah.
Has changing the world ever been an aim of yours?
I think, on the whole, books don't do that. You know, very rarely do that. I mean, there are some books, clearly, which have had a big impact. I mean, you know, the one that always comes to mind is Uncle Tom's Cabin, you know, which had a real influence on the slavery issue in America when it came out. I wouldn't wish to claim for my books anyway, that was any part of their aim. I think what happens with books is something more individual, that books don't change the world, but they change individuals. You know, that I think the experience, you know, as a reader, when you read a book that feels that you love, that you're swept up by, that you're captured by, then the book becomes a part of you. The vision of the writer becomes a little part of your vision, and you carry that away with you, you know, from the book. So I think that's the kind of magic of the form, is that because, you know, it's interior. The act of reading is inside the reader. You know, you go to see a movie, it's outside you. You know, you go and listen to a symphony, it's in front of you. You know, you read a book, it's in your head. And that intimacy creates sometimes quite profound shifts in the way in which people see the world. You know, and the magic of it is that neither the writer nor the reader knows if that's going to happen or when it'll happen or to whom it'll happen. You know, but if you're lucky as a writer, then you have some kind of impact like that.
And is that something you only discovered after being published and getting the feedback, or is it something you thought as you became a writer?
Because I thought about it as a reader before I was a writer. That, you know, I mean, I think if you ask most people what are the books they truly love, you know, it's probably a very small number. You know, it may be 3 or 4, it could be 7 or 8, but I don't think it's ever a huge number. You know, and
what are the books that changed you?
Well, it started off when I was a kid, you know, and I think one of the big first influences on me was Alice in Wonderland, you know, and both because of the imaginative, because of how imaginative it is, but also because of how beautifully written it is. You know? And I think when people think about Alice, they think about the characters, but actually to read it on the page, it's sentence by sentence, very beautiful. You know, and so that was, I mean, as a kid, there was that, and there was a moment when I was very influenced by The Lord of the Rings. When I was at school, I actually had a school teacher, a history teacher, who told me that I should read it because he thought I would like it. And I got, you know, completely swept away by it and almost failed my O-levels as a result. Then I started reading, when I was at college, I read an enormous amount of science fiction. I had a big kind of science fiction jag. And then almost...
I mean, do you mean Arthur C. Clarke science fiction?
I mean,
more...
No, I mean, yes, of course, the big names like Arthur C. Clarke and Ray Bradbury and Kurt Vonnegut and so on, but also the kind of hardcore you know, magazines called things like Amazing and Astounding, and in which they're writers that if you're not a science fiction buff, you probably don't know who is James Blish or Clifford D. Simak or Frederick Pohl and C.M. Kornbluth, you know, things like that. So I was quite deeply, Zena Henderson, I was quite deeply into it. And then I just somehow, like turning a switch, I stopped being interested in it. And
why?
I'm not exactly sure. I think part of it is just growing up. And part of it is that I felt that although the very best writers, you know, like Bradbury and Vonnegut and Arthur Clarke, you know, were wonderful writers, in many cases the quality of the writing is not very good, you know, and there's wonderful imagination and ideas, you know, but sometimes it's a bit clunky in the actual prose. And for a long time it was very male form. You know, there were very few women writing it, which is again different now with people like Margaret Atwood and Ursula Le Guin and so on, you know, but it used to be very masculine, and women in science fiction used to either be kind of space babes, you know, kind of Barbarella space babes, or they were, you know, white lab-coated technicians, and they're more or less nothing else. You know? So I got bored with that. But what I think is, and you know, since my writing has used elements of the fantastic all the way along, I think that kind of writing is a very good form for the exploration of ideas. You know, it's a kind of idea-driven fiction. I mean, Margaret Atwood actually has this nice phrase. She doesn't call it science fiction; she calls it speculative fiction, and I think that at its best, that's what it is. It asks a kind of what if question, and then imagines it.
I mean, you say your writings had fantastical. I mean, you're always described as magical realism.
Yeah,
I mean, is that how you think of yourself?
No, I mean, the thing is, there are these phrases like magic realism, which, in my mind, that applies specifically to a particular group of writers in Latin America from the late 50s to the early 70s. But magic realism, surrealism, fabulism, they're all more or less exactly the same thing, and they're phenomena that crop up in different literatures at different times. But they're basically, it's a way of writing which doesn't feel the need to be naturalistic, which can be more fantasticated than that. And that, you could say that Kafka is a magic realist. A man wakes up in the morning and discovers that he's turned into a giant bug. I mean, that would be now called magic realism, but he's doing it for a different reason.
This book, The Golden House, isn't doing that, is it?
No, but you see, that's really right, because the novel I wrote immediately before this, 2 years, 8 months, 28 nights, which if you do the maths is 1,001 nights, is also set in New York, as The Golden House is, but is a sort of fairy tale of New York. I mean, it has flying carpets and genies in it. And when I finished it, I had a very strong feeling that I didn't want to do that anymore. I felt that I'd actually taken that kind of writing and pushed it as far as it could go.
Ever? I mean, do you think that's the end of it?
No, it's not. Nothing is ever forever, but I just felt I don't want to do that. I want to do, in a way, something quite opposite to that, and so I had the idea of trying to write a big contemporary social novel of New York, which would try and take in themes that were actually out there in the world, that were things that people were thinking about and talking about, and to do something which in a way is a dangerous thing to try and do, which is to write right up against the present moment, which you're always told not to do, that you should have perspective and distance, so on. And that's good advice on the whole. It's riskier to do this. But if you can pull it off, then you sort of capture a moment.
And are you doing that because you've got something to say about the now? I mean, is this is political and social commentary?
Well, I think it's a moment of genuine, deep cultural crisis, in America, but not only in America, where the divisions in society have not been this deep during my lifetime. The conflict about the nature of the real, what do you believe to be true, has never been as extreme as it now is. And really, that was a starting point. It was to say, I want to try and write about a moment, primarily in American life in this book, but a moment that I think is not confined to America, in which people's divisions have reached a point where they have almost incompatible views of reality, and what does that mean? Because what does that mean for literature? One of the things I've always thought is that at the great height of the realist novel, Flaubert, Stendhal, Edith Wharton, there was broad agreement between the writer and the reader about what the world was like. There wasn't this kind of fragmented, conflicted view of the real. The writer could expect that the reader would have the same view about the truth as he or she did. That's no longer true.
I mean, do you think modern politics is the bigger threat to freedom of expression?
I think in certain parts of the world it is. Yes, yeah, but I don't think it's only politics. I think there's also a cultural shift where people, for quite often what they would believe to be virtuous, progressive reasons, become censorious. I mean, when I was starting out in this game, when there was a push towards censorship, it would usually come from the right wing. It would usually come from authoritarian voices. Now it comes as often from what one might call liberal progressive voices as from authoritarian voices.
Do you mean no platforming and all of that?
I mean all of that, yeah. I mean that people there seems to be, particularly in a generation younger than myself, a feeling that it's okay to suppress certain kinds of speech if they don't like it. You know, even the Western democracies draw these lines in different places. You know, so that here, for example, there is the Race Relations Act. You know, so if you make racist remarks, you can be pursued by the law for doing so. You know, and when I lived here, I thought, well, I don't see what's wrong with that. You know, seems fine to me. When you get to America, where the First Amendment is such a dominant issue, one of the things the First Amendment defends is free expression, even of very objectionable views. You know, and which is why racist groups like the Ku Klux Klan are able to function. You know, and my initial response was to think that there's something wrong with that. You know, because I was looking at it from the perspective that I'd formed here. And I gradually have come to change my view about that. I've come to think that it's actually more important that you know what people are thinking than to try and suppress thought, because objectionable thought doesn't disappear if you suppress it.
But no platforming isn't coming from the law here, is it?
No,
I mean, it's coming from some other thing. I mean, well, what do you think?
That's what I'm saying. That it's not only to do with politics. It's to do with cultural attitudes. You know, and I mean, it's interesting for me in America, where there's this whole thing, not just no platforming, but, you know, the issue of safe spaces in colleges and all that is quite alive. You know, I've found, I mean, I have a visiting professorship at NYU in New York, and I have found that I have never once in 20 years of being in the American Academy, I've never come across this, certainly never from graduate students. You know, it seems to be a thing that in some younger parts of the academy, you know, young people coming into the academy at age 18, 19, you know, some of them seem to have those attitudes. But by the time they've got to be 21, 22, 23, they don't have them anymore. You know, so I've begun to think that this is a growing up issue. You know, that people when they're young seem to feel, oh, I don't want to hear things that I'm uncomfortable with. You know, and when they get a bit older, actually, they do want to hear things they're uncomfortable with.
But why do you think it's happened? I mean, is it a reaction to Obama and the years of hope, and you know, is it the sort of the natural cycle? Well,
you see, I don't think it's no, because I don't think it's confined to America. You know, I mean, I think this is a global phenomenon, and that's why I'm saying it's not about politicians. It's about the culture of this younger generation that seems to be less confident about confronting ideas which they find unpleasant, you know. And I think one of the things that it's important to do, particularly if you're in any way involved with teaching, is to try and explain the importance of confronting ideas that you're not comfortable with, you know, and that actually it is what you might call education.
But it's very odd that this should happen, doesn't it? Because they're obviously being taught by older people who've been through this process.
Yes.
Their parents have also been through this. So why this culture should come about is a bit of a mystery, isn't it?
Well, it's, you know, I mean, I don't think that I have a full explanation for it, but I mean, it happens in different communities too. I mean, you find, for example, in the Muslim community that you have stricter observance in the younger generation than in the older generation, you know, and it's normally the opposite. Normally, children or young people are more liberal and rebellious and iconoclastic, you know, than their parents, and the parents are the fuddy-duddies who are sticklers for the rules.
Well, that's why I ask you whether it is just cyclical. I mean, is everything just a reaction to what's gone before?
Well, it may be. I mean, truthfully, I think we won't know for a while. And one of the things when I was writing The Golden House, there are a lot of issues that I felt were in the air, you know, in New York, that I wanted to somehow bring into the book. And one of the issues which is full of this kind of elephant trap and, you know, like a minefield, is the issue of gender politics, you know, and yet it's such a big subject right now certainly in New York City, that I thought it would be, if you're trying to write a book about the city at this moment, it would be wrong to exclude it, you know? And so then you have to really do your homework, you know, because I mean, I think there's a bit of me that has always felt that one aspect of the novel is not unlike reportage. You know, I mean, that's to say, Charles Dickens didn't just sit in his room and make things up. He would go out and find things out, And I think that it's very important for a writer not to get stuck in his own little cocoon, but to get out of the cocoon and find things out.
And do you feel you understand the way gender politics is changing?
I've tried to. I mean, I had some personal experience in the sense that I do know two people in America who have fully transitioned, and actually one in each direction, and in those cases, I would say that they've been very successful transitions, and the people involved are much happier people now than they were before. So I've seen that, but I thought it would be more interesting in a book to have not something as simple and happy as that, but to have a character who's very conflicted about it, and because that would allow me to explore the genuine conflicts that there are, in this area.
Do you think men are having a tough time with their own gender identities?
I think that's okay, though. I think it's about time men had a tough time. But I do think that that questioning, in general, is a good thing, and for things as central to human nature as sexual identity to become questioned, I think it takes you into very interesting places as an individual and as a community and as a writer, And so I went out to try and find out as much as I could, and then I very deliberately set myself the task of, there's a character in the book who is going through this kind of gender crisis, and I really wanted to not be judgmental about it. I wanted to simply present it. I wanted to say, here is what's happening in the world. Here are the issues that people have to face and confront and make up their minds about, and here is a human being going through that process, and I think it's really crucial in a novel not to be preachy, not to say, I think this is good or bad, but to create a space for the reader where the reader can enter the book, feel that there's a world being shown to them that is interesting to them, and then they can decide what they think about it. As a reader, I don't like a book that wags a finger at me and tells me what to think.
Can we go back? I mean, when did you decide you wanted to be a writer?
Well, I mean, it decided, really. I mean, in the sense that I never really had another plan.
Because you went into advertising first.
Well, I did that because I needed to pay the rent. I left university thinking that I wanted to be a writer. But unlike some of my contemporaries, it took me a very long time to find my voice and my way as a writer. So, there were people, I mean, like Ian McEwan is 1 year younger than me, Martin Amis is 2 years younger than me, Julian Barnes is like 2 years older than me. They all seemed to, at a really relatively young age, know what they wanted to do and start doing it.
So is that about your upbringing? Is that about your childhood? I mean,
I think it has more to do with migration, actually. I think it has more to do with having grown up in one world and then relocated in another world.
How old were you when you moved from India?
Well, I came here to boarding school and then Cambridge, but I didn't move from India. My parents were still there, so I would go back. It was really only after I left Cambridge that I thought I would settle in London and try and be a writer. And then it took me a very long time to write anything worth reading.
So do you feel you were brought up by your school, effectively, or by your parents?
Well, I mean,
because that would be a pretty key factor in shaping what you thought you were going to be.
Well, I think the issue of family has been very central in my work, and I think that's partly because, if you come, it's not just your parents in India, it's a kind of extended family. And my family was interesting because it was divided more or less equally, 50-50 between India and Pakistan. So in my generation, we were still able to go back and forth in a way that doesn't happen so much now. And so I grew up with a knowledge of both countries, and then I discovered when I was trying to be a writer that was really no longer the case, that people in India had very stereotypical views of Pakistan, and people in Pakistan had very stereotypical views of India, and so when, a novel like Midnight's Children, in the subcontinent, actually in part had the effect of opening up each country to the other, and I thought that was very interesting, that the way I had, the generation I grew up in, which was able to bridge the two countries, was followed by generations in which that bridge had broken down, and wasn't there anymore. And literature, in a way, was one of the ways of creating that bridge.
those stereotypical views are probably worse now
Yes.
than they were then, aren't
Yeah,
they?
yeah. They are, because the gulf between the societies has become deeper. And the hostility, because of the rise in India of Hindu nationalist politics, has created deeper divisions between Hindu and Muslim communities in India than there have been for a long time, probably since the partition massacres.
Are you shocked or surprised that the sort of the Hindu response to a more confident, vocal, militant in some places Islam was more confident, vocal, and fundamentalist Hinduism?
Yeah, you see, I don't think it was a response to Islam. I think it was generated by itself. I think there's been an element in Indian public life, let's say, which has increasingly moved away from the secularist ideas of the founding fathers, so to speak. The fact that the Constitution was created to exclude all mention of religion, and that was because people like Nehru and Gandhi believed that if you were to, as it were, Hinduize the Constitution, that would be a recipe for social conflict, and they're probably right. But what's happened now is the rise of generations in India which don't think like that, and which are much more open to the ideas expressed by Hindu nationalists that this is a country where 85% of the country is Hindu anyway, and that should be the dominant ideology of the country, and I mean, this administration has managed to gain a really wide degree of popularity by pushing that line, and of course, to somebody of my generation, brought up in the kind of Nehruvian way to believing in the importance of the secular tradition in India, this is very worrying, and I think I see India becoming a less attractive place as a result.
Have you been to Pakistan in recent years?
No, I can't. I'm not allowed to go to Pakistan.
Since
1989.
Since 1989.
Yeah.
I mean, well, let's talk about then, if we can, because I mean, a lot of our listeners won't be entirely familiar with what happened. In 1988, you published the Satanic Verses, and all hell broke loose. Did you have any sense that you were doing something that was going to provoke a reaction?
Well, I mean, put it like this: the kind of religious community, like mullahs and so on, had never liked anything I'd written. So I assumed they wouldn't like this either. But that was the kind of shrug of the shoulders attitude. My view is that the odd thing is that I thought it was in some ways the least political book that I'd written, because Midnight's Children dealt with the birth of India and many public events that happened around that time, up to and including the years of the so-called emergency in the mid-70s, and
when Mrs. Gandhi was accused of all sorts of dreadful
suspending
things.
democracy and so on. And Shame was a novel that also came out of thinking about the conflicts between military and civilian leaders in Pakistan, and in particular, the strange case of Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, who appointed Zia-ul Haq as his chief of staff because he thought he could control him, and then Zia became his executioner. And I thought that idea that your protege becomes your executioner is an almost Shakespearean idea, and I wanted to write about that. And then when I thought that those two novels were, in a way, my way of reckoning with the world that I had come from. The world of South Asia, of the South Asian subcontinent, India and Pakistan. And then I thought, well, but I don't live there, I live here now. And I thought that therefore the thing I should do is to write about the phenomenon of migration, and in particular migration from India and Pakistan to England. And this was a book written in the middle 80s, at the time, the period which came to be thought of as high Thatcherism. And a time in which there was a lot of racial conflict, in England, and really, it's a novel about that. It's a novel about what it is to be an Indian immigrant in England. Some of them wealthy, many of them not wealthy, living in a kind of fictional suburb of London, which is sort of a mixture of Brixton and Southall, and what are their lives like?
Were you uncomfortable as an immigrant in England in the 80s?
I had uncomfortable moments. I think there's everybody who comes from that part of the world and has settled here will have stories to tell you about things that happened to them.
Racial abuse and all that.
Yes. Yeah, and I mean, so did I. I wouldn't say it was nearly as bad for me as for many people, because it's, in a way, I was insulated by being in a fairly liberal environment, in terms of the people I knew in the worlds I'd inhabited. But yeah, of course it happens. And anyway, so I thought I was writing a novel about the consequences of migration. And I thought there's one thing, which is the external consequences, right? The social consequences. But there's another just as important, which are the internal consequences in the self. Because one of the things that happens in the act of migration is that very often people lose things that are considered to be the roots of the self, like the language you speak, the community in which you live, in which you are known and where you know people. All these things which are very central parts of the way in which we define ourselves as human beings. Suddenly, they're not there. You're in a place you don't know, with people speaking languages you don't speak that well, and with belief systems that may not be yours. And how do you deal with that? It's as if the entire self is put into crisis and is questioned. And people have to answer that question individually for themselves and as a community. And that can be very difficult, and it can create intergenerational strife, all sorts of things. So I thought, I'm writing about that, and if what I'm saying is that all these aspects of the self, including belief systems, are put into question, then the book should do that. The book should put them into question, and let's see what happens. So that's what I thought I was doing. And as I say, I thought I was writing my least political novel.
I mean, what happened was a load of people who hadn't read the book ended up hating it.
Having an opinion.
And having an opinion and debating it. I actually got a death threat because of the Satanic Verses in 1990.
Oh, congratulations.
I hosted a debate on BBC Two about it and about the reaction, and I gave somebody a very hard time about the Iranian reaction, and I ended up with a threat of my own. It was an extraordinary time.
Well, death threats sadly have become part of the currency of the time.
Today, but not then. It was an extraordinary time. And the thing for me about that, looking back on it, is it was the first time my generation, and I think a lot of people in Britain, were exposed to the idea that, a militant minority of Muslims could dramatically change your life.
Yeah. It was a very ugly moment.
And we've been living with that ever since, is the thing.
And I think what I like in the specific issue of the Satanic Verses is that, as you say, at the time that it came out, there were all these opinions which were, broadly speaking, uninformed, because many of them had never opened the copy of the book. So, with the passage of what is now 30 years, and with the lowering of the temperature, a lot of people have read the book. And the book is widely studied, etc. And what that means is that now, after all this time, it's finally able to have the ordinary life of a book. That some people love it, some people can't stand it, and some people are somewhere in between. And that's what normally happens to a book. And that abnormally never happened to this book. And now people read it, and as I say, the things that I was saying earlier that I think the book is really about, people are beginning to see that that's actually what it's about, and beginning to find points of contact with it that they didn't know they would have. And also that it's quite funny, and one of the things, because of what happened to it being completely not funny, people didn't think that of the book as being potentially would make them laugh, and I've had any number of people telling me that they read the book and who knew that it would make you laugh. And I said, well, people who read the book knew. and so I'm pleased, in a way, that the book has reached a point where it can be appreciated in literary terms, for what it actually is doing, rather than for what people imagined it was doing.
With a brief exception of a period shortly after the fatwa, you have stuck to your views on religion. And you haven't been afraid to express them.
No, I mean, of course not.
Have you But I mean, has it affected what you would write about?
Well, it
I mean, have you veered away from Islam, basically?
No. I just thought. I mean, I wrote long after the Satanic Verses, I wrote a novel called Shalimar the Clown, which deals with Islamic terrorism, quite centrally. And the main title character is somebody who becomes a jihadist, and a lot of the book goes into that world. So no, but that I never really thought of myself as a religious writer, and I never thought that that's my subject. I thought it's one of the things there is to write about, and of course it's true that as religion has become so important and central in the modern world, then if you're a writer trying to reflect that world, you have to take that into account. And whether you're personally religious or not, you have to be aware of the fact that it's a force out there, and try and deal with that.
Do you see a line though between the authoritarian regimes, whether they are religious or political, who try to stifle freedom of speech, and what's currently going on with our political class, who are trying maybe not to stifle freedom of speech, but to just deny the truth and to freeze out those people who have their own version of the truth?
I think essentially what it is, I think, is that the reason why politics and literature have often been in conflict is that politicians, even quite moderate politicians, want to control the narrative. They want to say, here's how you should think about what's happening, and this is how it is. And the more authoritarian or doctrinaire a public figure gets, the more insistent they are of that their way of seeing things is the only way. And when it gets to the level of tyranny, that has the consequence that if you don't agree with us, we will come after you.
So where does Trump fit into that line?
Well, Trump is very much trying to control the narrative. I mean, his whole thing was to come in and throw away the narrative and make up a new one. And so you have, and that's why, oddly, doctrinaire authoritarian regimes have always been so alarmed by literature. You think that, I mean, what is literature? Writers don't have any armies, they don't have any electorates, why is it that journalists and novelists and playwrights and poets are the people who get locked up? And it's because they are the people who are able to provide a counter-narrative, and to say, the world is not like that, it's like this. And when you say it's like that, you're not telling the truth. And in times like this, that's a very important role.
But Trump doesn't care about artists, does he?
No.
Perhaps because he's never read a book. But he does care about journalists.
He cares about anybody saying anything.
And the media, yes.
Yeah, he cares about, because, and of course, they have not been, by and large, give or take Fox News, they've not been on his side. But he has quite clearly understood understood the term fake news to be news that is not sympathetic to him, and he more or less explicitly says so. He says the media are very hostile to me, and that's fake news. And the idea that they may be hostile to him because of what he's doing, rather than out of some a priori prejudice, doesn't occur to him. So, as I say, when I wrote this novel, the world I was looking at, the world of New York City in particular, but America in general.
And a property developer from a rich family who's entering politics.
But it was this fractured world, this world in which one side of the argument claimed that what the other side of the argument said was just a lie, and vice versa. And I thought that's a country in crisis. That's a culture in crisis. If people can't even agree on the simplest definitions of what is true, and I wanted the book to explore that.
Do you have any sense of what comes next?
Politically or literally?
Culturally.
Culturally. Well, I think I don't. The answer is I'm not sure, and I think I've come to feel in the United States anyway that we're going to find out in November, which is when the midterm elections are. I mean, at the moment, it seems as if there's quite a large swing away from the Republicans. And I think, but, November's a long way away. And who knows what the situation will be at that time. But it seems to me we'll find out at that point whether this phenomenon, the ultra-populist demagoguery of Trump, whether that's an aberration, and that normal service will shortly be resumed, or whether it's like the new normal, and we have to get used to the fact that we're going to have another 6 years of him.
But even with or without Trump, the divisions are there, aren't
The divisions are there, and that's, I think, the deeper problem, which I think all of us, I mean, a lot of writers in America are thinking, how do we address this? And I think you have to address it in different ways, partly in your work, but as I say, didactic novels are bad novels. But you also have to address it outside your work.
So are you saying you don't pick a side in this?
No, I think it's quite clear which side I'm on, but I'm not beating you over the head with it, is what I'm saying. I'm writing about a particular group of people who see the world a particular way, but you don't necessarily have to agree with them. And it's been interesting to me that the book has been really very well received in America, including in some quite conservative parts of the world, and hasn't really become the center of that kind of yes, no, right, wrong, true, false argument. And that makes me feel that maybe I did something right. And
you personally, are you choosing a side and joining it? Because I mean, I was looking at your Twitter, for example, before we started this, and it seems to have stopped in 2016.
I got sick of it. I was getting sick of it anyway, and I just used that day as a moment to stop. I mean, I think something, and I've asked myself whether it was I that changed or whether it was Twitter that changed. And I actually think it may be some of each, but a lot of it has to do with, I think it's become a much more unpleasant space.
Yeah, definitely.
And than when I first started, embarked on that adventure, it was kind of friendlier, and it's become much more adversarial and unpleasant.
Well, what I mean is, if this is such a divided society, which it clearly is, do you but in your books you don't want to be didactic. Does there come a time, do you think, when you will have to pick a side and fight for it in your life?
Yes.
And say, no, this is what I stand for.
Yes,
and
that time is now. That time is now. And that's what I'm saying. There's a function that literature can fulfill. And there's a non-literary function which is like, as a citizen you have to have a point of view. I mean, it's quite clear who I vote for, and I do try and argue. I mean, I go around the country lecturing about these things, and sometimes in Republican areas. I mean, I went to lecture not so long ago in a town in Florida which is 100% Trump voters. And I mean, what I liked about it, I mean, it's a big audience, and they came to, and they know, I mean, so there's no secret about what my views are, and they came to hear me, and they didn't boo, they didn't shout, they didn't walk out, they didn't throw things, they heard me out. But when we got into a kind of Q&A, it was quite clear how deep the gulf was, and how even though this was not a classic Trump voter at all, this wasn't the kind of badly educated blue-collar male, these were actually white-collar retirees, quite well-off, college-educated, book readers, and yet they had completely drunk the Kool-Aid. So they would stand up and deny climate change, and they would, one of them said to me, "Do you really think the New York Times isn't just lying to us every day? You really think that?" And I said, "Well, yeah, I do think that, except when they're reviewing my books." But I thought it was, actually, I was quite encouraged by that engagement, because it took place in a civilized way. That people with radically different, you might say even incompatible worldviews, were able to sit in a theater and argue without it deteriorating into a slanging match.
So what's the next book?
Well, I'll let you know. I mean, but it's not like
you're not working on one now.
Yes, I am. Yeah, but
it's a secret.
It's the only rule I have really is not to talk about unfinished work, because it changes so much in the act of making. That a thing I could tell you now might not be true in 2 years' time when the book comes out. But it's not like this, because I think I really have a kind of dislike of repeating myself. So as I say, I wrote this fairy tale, and the reaction to that was to write an unfairy tale, and now I want to do something else, something. This is a bit crazier, this book that I'm writing, but I think I'll come back and talk about it in a couple of years.
Do you feel you're getting better I mean, if you think about Midnight Children, it was almost 4 decades ago.
I know.
I mean, it's extraordinary. And is that your most decorated book? It probably is. Isn't
it? It's been around longer than most of them, but what I like about it is that even though, when I started writing it, was about 1976, 77. I mean, I was like 28, 29 years old, and when it came out, I was 33 years old. Now I'm about to be 71, and the fact that that book still feels relevant to young generations of readers who were not born when I was writing it, that I take pride in, because I think the point if you want to write this kind of book, you write it because you hope that it will endure. That's really what you want to imagine, is that long after you yourself cease to be here, there'll still be a shelf of books that people are interested to pick up and read. And so for me, that's more important than prizes. It's more important that the book seems to last.
Which of your books do you think passes that test?
I don't know. Midnight Children, because it's a very old book and it's still around. I mean, I think actually Haroun and the Sea of Stories, the book I wrote for my older son, that seems to have a very vivid life in the minds of young people who've grown up and then given it to their children, and I like that. I don't know. I mean, I happily won't be around to know the answer to that question, but Martin Amis has this nice phrase where he says, what you hope to do is to leave behind a shelf of books. You want to think, okay, from here to here on the bookshelf, it's me. And now, I mean, you were asking about the Satanic Verses. The Satanic Verses was the 4th novel that I published. It was the 5th book that I published. This is the 13th novel and the 18th book that I've published. So that period, although yes, it was a significant period, it just feels like a very long time ago. And I'm just happy to have the shelf of books. And that, I don't know, people seem to still want to read them, which is not dead yet.
Salman Rushdie, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.